Hello viewers, my name is Zach Hardy, and let's be honest here. We are only a few weeks away from Call to Greatness 13. As a matter of fact, today marks 35 days until we get to the greatest wrestling show of the year, and this year it is Call to Greatness 13. Now when it comes down to Call to Greatness 13, there are some very interesting things about it. It's different from a lot of Call to Greatness cards we've seen in years prior beforehand. And on top of that, it takes place on April 29, 2018, but in Newark, New Jersey, which is also where another very famous USW pay-per-view took place. Maybe not in the same building, but in the same city nonetheless. Now, before we get into that, when you think of Call to Greatness and you think of the name Call to Greatness, you may think about specific things. Whether it may be the stacked card of Call to Greatness 11 back in 2016, or whether it may be Derek Carter versus Morbid, or whether it may be just the fact that ever since 2014, every Call to Greatness has been extremely well received, but at the same time, you might think back to a specific number of moments in Call to Greatness history, and when you think of some of those moments, there are few that actually stand up as defining to USW. For one, you have, the Enigma debut, when he took the championship, James's first USW championship, away from him at the end of the Blue Belt Championship tournament, which obviously you see how that turned out years later. You see Lone Wolf begin his love-hate relationship with the main event spot. You had a card that was put together based off of guys that in the future would go on to do career-defining things. And at the end of the day, you got the first 5-star rated match in USW history where everything was on the line. And those aforementioned moments all took place at one show, in one place, in one building, on one day, and that is a defining day for USW and for the Call to Greatness brand, as it is looked at as one of, if not the single greatest USW pay-per-view of all time, let alone Call to Greatness pay-per-view of all time. And that pay-per-view took place on April 27th, 2014 in Newark, New Jersey in the Verizon Coliseum, and that pay-per-view was USW Call to Greatness 9. Now, when it comes down to Call to Greatness, we've seen a lot of changes over the years. We've seen it become a supercard. We've seen it become the be-all and end-all of a USW calendar year, the same way WrestleMania is to the WWE. And here we are, 4 years later, looking back on what was and what is now. And when you think of classic matches, a lot of them tend to come from the 2013-2014 era of Ultimate Showcase Wrestling. And since everybody to this day continues to cite Call to Greatness 9 as not only the start of a whole Call to Greatness litany with Call to Greatness 9, 10, 11, 12, and maybe even this year 13, all having fantastic ratings and fantastic reviews by wrestling critics alike, Call to Greatness to this day is still looked at as the greatest USW Call to Greatness pay-per-view of all time and wrestling pay-per-view of all time when it comes down to USW. And when you look back at it, it's very different to today's product in USW. It's surprising to see just how different things can be in the span of as little as 4 years. Because here we are at Call to Greatness 13, which takes place in the same city as Call to Greatness 9. And Call to Greatness 9, the matches that were put together were so completely different from what you see in USW programming today. The creative direction is different. The performers have gone and done things that they didn't have a chance to do at that point in time. And on top of that, everything about Call to Greatness was completely different. It's not something that I think you would look at and go, that was fantastic nowadays, but you do now because of the nostalgia. It was one of the greatest pay-per-views really USW could have ever even dreamed to produce at that point in time. And when you watched it live, it was just this burst of incredibly diverse wrestling that years later you look back on fondly because of the nostalgia. Whether it holds up now or not, it was still a fantastic pay-per-view at the time. And because of that, people look back on it with fond memories, despite maybe not seeing the modern taste of their modern wrestling taste in the show itself. The same way that, like, WrestleMania 1 is looked back on so fondly in today's era, where WrestleMania is in its 34th annual edition. And so I thought, well, while we're here 4 years later, at Call to Greatness 13 very quickly approaching, I want to look back at Call to Greatness 9 and see exactly why it was such a great pay-per-view in the moment, and a fantastic sighting of nostalgia for a great pro wrestling fan. And when you look at the card, it's not surprising to kind of feel great about the card, because you see so many of the performers that left and did great things, that did great things at that point in time and are consistent now, or had a whole future ahead of them that you didn't really predict at the time. And so, with that, let's see the good and the bad of USW Call to Greatness 9 in the first episode of what I hope to be a semi-consistent series called Rewind Review, or Review Rewind, or something along those lines. And if you want to see more of these where I go back and I review old USW pay-per-views, or old WWE pay-per-views, and JPW pay-per-views, hell, even TNA pay-per-views, or Impact pay-per-views, or whatever the LLC is this week, or even backyard shows like Extreme Showdown Wrestling, or EBE Films Wrestling, I would absolutely be open to it, and I would really like to see what it's like as a modern fan to go back and see those pay-per-views with a different mindset on professional wrestling. And I think this is the greatest way to start this series. Now, when it comes down to Call to Greatness 9, there were, I believe, 16 or 17 in total matches, and everything on the card was just so fucking strange at the time, just because of how it was built and the performers that were used. But let alone, let's go and check out from top to bottom with a new review of Call to Greatness 9. By the way, that Call to Greatness 9 was the first USW and wrestling pay-per-view overall that I ever got the opportunity to review. So this is a very fond memory of my in term, and I'm just glad I'm doing it as myself instead of Chase Clover with a shitty British accent and midway out through puberty review. So that being said, I hope you enjoy. We get into the kickoff match to start the show, and it is Ashe versus Titanfall. Now, at the time, Titanfall was being groomed for a mid-card push, I believe, towards the Extreme Championship picture, which would eventually, most likely, at that time, move to a Blue Belt Championship picture, whilst Ashe was kind of crumbling away from the USW Blue Belt Championship picture before reigniting his feud with Anarchy that went on for what seemed like ages, though when you look back on it, you look back on it with fond memories. Now, this, pay-per-view featured a lot of talent that would go elsewhere or succeed later on, or succeed elsewhere on their own accord. And when it came down to this match in particular, you saw Titanfall being groomed for something a little bit more than just the kickoff match, because at the time, the kickoff match wasn't seen as high stakes as it is now, where it's this proving ground for performers to be able to say, I trust you to open the show on a good note, so go out there and kick ass. This was more of the kind of case of this was the opening spot to showcase some of the underused talent and gain the eyes quickly right at the start of the show. And I think that was the case with Titanfall and Ashe, especially when it came down to Ashe getting out of the Blue Belt Championship picture and Titanfall being groomed for something a little bit more. They wanted the eyes to be on them, especially at a pay-per-view like Call to Greatness. Now, this match was actually much faster and exciting than I was really anticipating, especially knowing back when Titanfall was a semi-technical wrestler, but much more of a powerhouse, and Ashe was just this versatile and athletic performer that was able to sneak his way out of anything, whether it be like a chin hold or just a simple like fisherman suplex. He would be able to escape anything and moderate the tone to fixate to what really favored him. And at the time, you could absolutely tell who was being groomed for much more, or who was being groomed for something more than just a mid-card spot, because you had Titanfall. From what I could gather from the pay-per-view, you had Titanfall over the past few weeks beforehand looking a little bit more consistent when it came down to overall performance. So you could tell that they were kind of grooming him to be much more prominent on Intensity programming, because if you remember, Intensity was the only show at this point in time, and I don't believe it even had 100 episodes by this point. So that was definitely interesting. Now, this match was, again, as I said, much faster and exciting than I was really anticipating, because Titanfall wasn't really the quickest performer. Not that he would, suffer from like a shortage of breath or cardio problems during any match, and he would be gassed by the midway point of the match, but it was just he had a more strong, I'm going to punch you in the face and just continue it while you're down kind of style that didn't really translate to an up-tempo kind of pace. And when it came down to this match, it really showcased Ashe's resilience, but Titanfall's dominance, and I think that worked very well, despite the fact that Titanfall would later go on to kind of just fumble in a mid-card championship position and would eventually leave the company in, I believe, 2015 or 2016, while Ashe is still around today just kind of trying to find his footing again. This was a really good match to watch, especially going back and seeing what the performers did afterwards, and I was really entertained to remember and recall the fast and exciting tempo that you really didn't expect going into that match, and I can't say enough about it. When it comes down to the rating, I would give it 3.75 stars. It was absolutely great in terms of story, and it was much more unexpected going into the match if you knew the character's background than you would have assumed. So that's going to be 3.75 stars. Great way to open up Call to Greatness 9. The second match, which was probably, if you look back on it, one of the more forgettable matches on the card, and it was Dadawg versus Dustin and Raymond. By the way, Titanfall did defeat Ashe in the opening match. Now, when it came down to both of these performers, Dustin Raymond would have a come-and-go relationship with USW a number of years later when it came down to going to the Severity brand, kind of trying to headline that, a defining feud when it came down to the early stages of Severity for the World Championship against Western Light, which would culminate at Call to Greatness 11 in 2016 before he would eventually leave the company, show up sporadically for a one-off appearance, every 6 or 7 months, and would eventually come back earlier this year in 2018 at the Insanity match as a part of the Wednesday Night Intensity brand. So that was Dustin Raymond's outcome from later on going forward. Now, especially in Call to Greatness 9, he was just off of a Blue Belt Championship feud with Dwayne Porter, which stands to this day as a defining feud when it came down to the Blue Belt Championship. He would eventually go on to win the USW Championship, I believe once. He would lose it to Dwayne Porter the following year at Call to Greatness 10, which was a very exciting match, especially since it was the main event at Call to Greatness 10. He would eventually go on, as I said, to headline the Severity brand and become the world champion of the Severity brand. And that would, of course, lead to a loss at Call to Greatness 11, in which Western Light would win the title in a steel cage match, and then I believe it was Fernandez would cash in or utilize his key and case opportunity and take the world title from him. Then that led to the triple threat, so on and so forth. And for Dadawg, this would be, I believe, his only Call to Greatness appearance 2014 and beyond, as he would then go on to be a part of the Soul Bulletproof series in USW, which he would not come out the victor of, but would come very close when it came down to other guys in the tournament, especially DHIG. That tournament, of course, being notable for the moment in which Rush was fired from USW for being found out for taking steroids, as he was caught smoking weed at the beginning of 2013 and was suspended for 4 months. That would eventually, in that suspension, the first-time suspension would eventually go into 8 months, and once it became more relaxed and people got ahead of that, they kind of let them off a leash a little bit and made it a 6-month suspension, and it's been that way since the beginning. So when he got the second strike for being found out of taking steroids, he was booted from the company in the middle of the Bulletproof series, despite being slated to win the whole thing and get a world championship push. So very, very poor timing for Rush. He's really like the Chris Benoit of USW so far, because that's never been a problem ever since then. When it came down to Dadawg, he was up there with DHIG and Rush in the Bulletproof series. He would not come out the victor of that Bulletproof series. He would kind of slum around in the mid-cards to lower mid-cards for the next couple of months, and then he would eventually leave USW. Now, this match was not really entertaining. It definitely let down the pace from the kickoff match. Raymond was still kind of finding his way into a mid-card picture, especially with the whole circumstance around the case of having to come into his own and not let the Blue Belt Championship define him. So that was definitely, I think, this proving ground for Dustin Raymond. Dadawg, on the other hand, I don't know whether he was off on that night or whatever it may be, but the match was slow. It wasn't very interesting. There was not much to look forward to or get intrigued by, and especially when it came down to the very end of the match, there was not much to really look forward to. Dustin Raymond would eventually beat Dadawg, and that would set on the course for the rest of both men's careers. Next match was actually a very big sign of the era of USW that we were in at that point in time, as we had BP Fierce versus Benny Franklin. Now, this was before Benny Franklin, and as we'll get to later on in the night, Ezra and Kills. This was before Benny Franklin and Ezra and Kills became a tag team, of which I think, if you wanted to describe the USW tag division, you would probably put Ezra and Kills and Benny Franklin as the most prominent tag team in USW history. They had not started teaming by this point in time. They were both trying to find their footing as singles performers that they really couldn't do, and eventually got into a tag team, which would run the course for the next couple of years before they would break up and go on their own ways as singles performers in 2017. So they had that run in 2014 through 2017 in which they just mowed down the tag division when were really the USW's defining tag teams after Switchblade and Blade split and CED and ED split, as we'll both get to those teams very soon. Now, this was a very tough match. Benny Franklin was more of a powerhouse, whilst BP Fierce was really a powerhouse but a brawler more so, and it was a really hard-hitting match. Now, I remember going, and I remember saying something about this in my review a number of years ago, because it was a really big standout. BP Fierce was this really very strong, very built, very muscular guy that would never go to the top rope or even look at the top rope or turnbuckle for that matter, unless he was throwing a performer into it. So what happened was, you would have he had Benny Franklin in the corner. He looked around at the audience and just went to the side and went up to the top rope. And at this point in time, everybody in the crowd just started standing up because they knew, oh, we don't see this very often. And he ended up hitting a fucking backflip, which he would miss, but he ended up going for a backflip nonetheless, which is absurd when you think of a guy like BP Fierce in the middle of a match at Call to Greatness. Now, eventually, Benny Franklin would win with a big boot, as he was not using the Blue Bomber at that point in time. This was a very tough and very physical match. It really picked up the pace from where Dustin, Raymond, and Dadawg left off, and I give it 3.75 stars. And by the way, Dustin, Raymond, and Dadawg get 3.25 stars. Benny Franklin, as I said later on, or as I said, would later on go on to team with Ezra and Kills and would just run through the tag team division as a career-defining and promotion-defining tag team for years to come before splitting up on his own and becoming a monster, a wrecking crew, not to be messed with. And BP Fierce would eventually kind of find his way a little bit. He would be a part of the Bulletproof series for a couple of months, and then would really not do much afterwards. I think he went into a short Blue Belt Championship feud, and that was about it. And he would end up leaving the company in 2015, and that's really been the feature over the past number of years. So 3.75 stars, very tough, very hard-hitting match, opened up the pace from Raymond and Dadawg from where they left off very well. The next match on the card was for, at the time, what was called the Unified USW Tag Team Championships. It was not the USW Tag Team Championships at the time, as there was the talk of World Tag Team titles and USW Tag Team titles by Reese Sr. and Reese Jr. at the press conference, in which case they would announce the titles, and they decided, screw it, we'll just put them together and make one belt. So they went with the Unified USW Tag Team Championship name, of which Fernandez and Gringo would defend on this night against CED and ED. When it comes down to the shows later on, or the years going forward, CED and ED eventually left USW in 2014 or 2015. This was really the year in which they started making moves as a tag team. They would eventually come back to USW in 2018 for a very short period of time, just to kind of get in the middle of the tag team division to add some depth and offer their wisdom for other younger tag teams that are being groomed now. They helped out Jack Ramsey and Austin Cole back when they were just backstage monitors on the Intensity brand back in April of 2017. And now they kind of mentor MP45 and so on and so forth. But CED and ED had lost the Unified USW Tag Team Championships to Fernandez and Gringo about a month or two prior to this. Now, Fernandez and Gringo would eventually go on to continue to tag team and also be single stars. They would become the inaugural International Championship feud with Majigeta and Western Light a year later. The international title was not around at Call to Greatness 9, hence why it's not a match on the card. They would eventually split. Fernandez would go to Severity, Gringo would go to Intensity. They would just kind of swarm around. Fernandez would get main event push for a little bit, would kind of fall back down the radar a little bit, had a couple of matches with Austin Atomic, and that was about that. Got sent over to the Intensity brand later in the year of 2017 after Warzone 2, or Warzone 3. I think it was Warzone 2. And would eventually team with with Gringo again at the end of 2017. And now they are the Marvelous Brothers, or the Marvelous Duo, or something like that. I don't think they have a team name yet, but they're back once again, and I believe they have a spot on the Call to Greatness 13 card again. Here they are defending the USW Unified USW Tag Team Championships. It was a decent match. Neither tag team was really a defining tag team at this time. Fernandez and Gringo had held the tag titles a couple of times by this point in time. CED and ED were coming into their own, and I think this was really a proving ground to establish them as teams in the running for a tag team title spot, but it never really amounted to very much. I give it 3.5 stars. Fernandez and Gringo would defeat CED and ED to retain the Unified USW Tag Team Championships, and all I can really say about it was that it was an alright match. It was okay. One of, if not the most forgettable match on the Call to Greatness 9 card was Switchblade versus Blade. Now this is after Blade and Switchblade, or the team of Switchblade and Blade, had broken up and started feuding. A couple of months later, I believe it was Switchblade would team with Dustin Raymond, and Blade would team with Dwayne Porter. So Dwayne Porter and Dustin Raymond were having a feud. Switchblade and Blade and Switchblade were having a feud, so they just pieced them together to kind of save room on title or on pay-per-view cards to see what would stick, but never really came about of much. And then that was dropped a couple of months down the line, and it was really one of those things that people went, why is this happening? Just stop it. And I was one of those people included. It made no sense, and breaking up Switchblade and Blade also made no sense. Now, you hear stories, because later on they would leave the company, and you would hear stories later on about how Switchblade and Blade both did not like the fact that they were, kind of going down the card in terms of the tag team spot and contention, and also the feud in which they had split them up and then made them team with Porter and Raymond, respectively. That they had had enough and just had left the company because they didn't feel like they were being utilized properly. I don't know the truth about that to this day, but what I do know is that Switchblade and Blade had a match at Call to Greatness 9, and it wasn't the best. It was really a very dominant match for Switchblade, who was a much bigger and taller competitor and a stronger competitor compared to Blade. The accurate description would have it be like Team Hell No. Switchblade was like the Kane of the team, and Blade was the Daniel Bryan of the team. But neither of them were really single stars, so it wasn't like Kane and Daniel Bryan. It was more like if the Legion of Doom had split up, and one of them was like Kane, one of them was like Daniel Bryan, and they were feuding against each other. It made very little sense, and Switchblade was the only one that looked great, which is why they had them pair with Dwayne Porter and Dustin Raymond, so that way the feud wouldn't be as lopsided and they can keep going, but it never really worked. This match wasn't great. This match was nothing memorable, and I gave it 3 stars at best just because it was the start of a feud and it at least had something going forward down the line. Next match was a match between Rain and Prophecy, in which case Rain would get a neck injury. He would suffer a neck injury. Wouldn't keep him out long. He would, I believe he would go on to be a part of the Bulletproof series a couple of months later. Wouldn't go very far, but this was a feud between Prophecy and Rain. Now, obviously, we know where both of those went down years later. Prophecy is still around. He's kind of swimming around looking for something to do, as he has been for about a year now. And Rain would kind of just slum around in the lower mid-cards, eventually finding a team with Hernastley, which they would call... Or no, I'm sorry, he would find a team with, I believe, Amor. No, it was Hernastley and Amor. And Rain would find a team with, I think it was Crimson Red. I completely forgot who it was, but they would be called the Reigning Standard. And that would amount to nothing, and Rain would eventually leave the company. As I said, or as I mentioned, Rain would suffer a neck injury that wouldn't keep him out for very long, but it kind of kept the match down. The tempo wasn't really as high as you would expect. This was actually a match that I believe was expected to be halfway decent, and it was alright, but it wasn't really anything great or memorable. 3.25 stars. Prophecy would defeat Rain, and that would be that. And by the way, Switchblade beat Blade the match before. Next match was a metal chain hangman's match, one of the most enticing matches on the card, and it was between Alex Martin and George Martin. Now, both of those performers would stay with USW throughout the rest of the company's history, which is continuing to go today. They're actually still a tag team today. This was before Alex Martin was just Alex, where his name was just ALEX and then periods, so that way they couldn't add anything on afterwards. And George Martin kept the name. George Martin assaulted Alex Martin at the Insanity pay-per-view in 2014, earlier that February, which would break up the team. They would feud the following month at, I believe, Final Chapter, and then they would have another match at Call to Greatness 9, in which case Alex Martin would win. They had a metal chain hangman's match, and of course George Martin would refuse to tap, giving Alex Martin the win via knockout. 4 stars. It was exciting, and it was definitely one of those matches that had a great story to it. Alex wouldn't get a world championship run, though he really deserved one. It was a fantastic performer throughout, and unless George Martin was with Alex Martin, he wasn't really utilized all that much. A fair comparison is Alex Martin being Jeff Hardy and George Martin being Matt Hardy, though George Martin never really found the broken character, so he had never had that thing that set him apart, other than his team with Paul Orlando at the beginning stages of the Severity brand. So that we go into the Extreme Championship. It was a ladder match, because at the time, the gimmick for the championship was that every match had to be something where there was no disqualification. It was Crimson Red fighting MC4, who was defending the championship at the time. MC4 would eventually go on to leave the company. He would be the defining Extreme Champion, but that wouldn't really amount to much, as the Extreme title hasn't really been looked at promisingly as time went on. Crimson Red would eventually go on to win the World Heavyweight Championship on the Severity brand, and is now currently one of the most over guys in USW today. Always gets a great, loud crowd reaction. This was a much more exciting match and fantastic match than you went into the show thinking. Not many big shows in wrestling have a one-on-one ladder match. But this match, when it came down to USW, it was their equivalent to Shawn Michaels and Razor Ramon at WrestleMania 10. It wasn't like it was a promotion-defining match or something that you would go back years later and go, I still talk about that to this day. But it was a fantastic match in the moment, and you had both these performers had a bright future. Crimson Red would eventually go on to hold the Extreme title a couple of times. MC4 was, and I believe still will always be, the longest reigning Extreme Champion of all time. This match was great, 4 stars, and it really brought out the best in both performers. The next match was Lane versus Chris Ross. This was an easy match for Chris Ross to win. Despite it being really good, even today, this was obviously going to be a Chris Ross win. By this point in time, he had held the World Heavyweight Championship, or at the time, the USW World Heavyweight Championship 4 times. Lane was still in the mid-cards. He had a fantastic finisher with the fast lane, but never really amounted to anything. Lane would eventually leave the company a couple of years later, I believe in 2015. Chris Ross, still going to this day, was a part of, he was not a part of Appetite for Destruction. He was a part of a team with Philip Akron, which would fend for the USW titles, or fight for the USW tag team titles on the Intensity brand in 2015. He would eventually go to the Friday Night Severity brand, and he would become the leader of the Mobocracy, which is like the Nexus, but not the Nexus of USW. And yeah, since then he is now the current World Heavyweight Champion on the Severity brand, and he's doing all right for himself. This match was all right, too obvious to not see coming. 3.5 stars. It was all right. Next match was Ezra Rank Hills against Alexander Rotten. Now, this is a story for both performers of the future. Alexander Rotten would have a love-hate relationship with the main event position. This was before he beat Zach Hardy for the USW Championship in May of that year. I believe, actually, this was the last major show that Alexander Rotten was on before he fought Zach Hardy, because then he fought Hardy at the beginning of May. He took the USW title from him, and then he would lose it 3 days later, and they would fight, and so on and so forth. And Rotten would have a handful of USW championship reigns before going to the Severity brand years later. He would be a part of the Appetite for Destruction team and would eventually hold the USW Tag Team Championships. He is now currently in the mix for the World Heavyweight Championship. I'm not sure if he's become a Triple Crown winner at this point in time yet. Well, whatever it may be. And then Ezra Rank Hills, as I mentioned with Benny Franklin, would go on to team with Benny Franklin for years going forward, become a dominant tag team in the reigns of USW, run roughshod over the tag team division, would eventually break away from Benny Franklin at the beginning of 2017 to become the USW champion. And later on this year, Ezra and Kills would challenge Zach Hardy for the USW championship at Bulletproof, which would be his last USW title shot before Call to Greatness 12 in 2017, which he would beat Derek Carter, go on a run. Benny Franklin would get jealous. He would turn on Ezra and Kills. They would have a fantastic feud until Ezra and Kills would tear his patellar tendon and would be out till around most likely May of 2018, in which his run will most likely continue going forth. Both performers had a great future ahead of them. It was a great match. It was really good, especially for what you look back on as an origin story. And yeah, Ezra and Kills beat Alexander Rotten, 3.75 stars. Moving on. Next match was one of the best matches on the Call to Greatness card. It was Dwayne Porter versus Yo-Yo Joe. This is a great back and forth match. Both performers stacked up well against each other. The chemistry was there, and Dwayne Porter would eventually beat Yo-Yo Joe, 4.5 stars on the card. Not much else to talk about. Yo-Yo Joe would eventually go into a part-time kind of appearance deal with USW, be home most often. Dwayne Porter would go on to win the Blue Belt title. He would then go on to win the USW title from Dustin Raymond a year later at Call to Greatness 10. That would kind of harbor him as a main event player. It would prove he wasn't ready, and he would eventually go on to kind of swim around the mid-cards. Now has become the new USW Blue Belt champion, which is surprising. He's now once again held the most USW Blue Belt championships in total of all time, and that is really that, 4.5 stars, and that's that. Next match was the shocker of the night, worst match of the card, the entire card as well. Wilbur beat Capital, and looking back at that, Wilbur definitely did not do anything of note. He had a team with TJ that did nothing, and then he left the company. And Capital would become a multiple-time World Heavyweight Champion, would main event Call to Greatness 10, I believe, or would be a part of the Call to Greatness, whatever, maybe. He would feud with Majigeta later this year, going into Bulletproof as the World Heavyweight Champion, or the USW World Heavyweight Champion. And then once he would lose the title, he would kind of swim around in the mid-cards until getting an international championship run in 2017 as a part of the Mobocracy, being led by the aforementioned Chris Ross. And that was that. It was Wilbur beat Capital at Call to Greatness 9, of all shows. 2.75 stars, unexpected, but not a great match. Next match was a very confusing outcome of a match. Western Light beat Cannon after an Enigma interference. I'm not sure exactly what happened afterwards, but Cannon and Enigma would never feud, even though Enigma would cost Cannon his match with Western Light at Call to Greatness 9. 3.5 stars, but it was an alright match, but the ending was confusing. And we see how both performers have ended up now. Next match was the finals of the Blue Belt Championship Tournament. The former Blue Belt champion, I forgot who it was at the time, had gotten injured and therefore had to vacate the Blue Belt Championship. And therefore there was a tournament held, and the finals was Chain Reaction versus James. And James would go on to defeat Chain Reaction to win his first championship in USW as the Blue Belt Championship. 3.25 stars. It was a decent match, but the biggest talking point was what happened afterwards, with Enigma making his debut at Call to Greatness of all shows. Of course, Zach Hardy portraying Enigma and being found out later on in the year. Enigma would then go and confront James and demand he put the title on the line, and James would do so, and Enigma would make quick work of James. I believe James's total reign would last 3 minutes and 23 seconds, which was okay. And then James would obviously go back to win the title from Enigma about a month later in a three-way dance against Chain Reaction. And, you know, here we are looking back on that. Chain Reaction had a great run with Indigo Child in a tag team. They split up, did nothing of note. Now Chain Reaction is on the Intensity brand, just doing nothing. James would eventually go on to win the Blue Belt Championship and then the Red Belt Championship, and is now the current reigning USW champion, and has officially been recognized now as a Triple Crown winner in USW, one of only 7 performers, I believe 7 performers, in USW history to accomplish such feat. So with that being said, I'm not going to rank the Enigma and James match. It was nothing special. James got hit with a couple of punches and then hit with a spear and lost the title, but it would be somewhat redeemable since he had gone through a great match before, a decent match beforehand, but a great fight, and that would be that. Next match would be for the USW World Heavyweight Championship. Lone Wolf, the 2014 Insanity match winner, would go on to face Majigeta for the USW World Heavyweight Championship. It was a really entertaining match. It would begin Lone Wolf's love-hate relationship, as I said, with the main event picture in USW, 4.25 stars. Majigeta is now consistently one of the greatest performers in USW history, putting on great matches and great shows. And that's about that. That's where it stands. And then we have the main event of Call to Greatness 9 for the USW Championship. Winner, or it would be Streak versus Championship, Career versus Career. Zach Hardy defends the USW Championship against Morbid, and looking back on it, this is the USW defining match for a reason. It had everything. It had struggle, it had power, it had just vulnerability, it had blood, it had everything. Especially the botch, which has now been coined the botch, where Morbid would pile drive Zach Hardy accidentally on the corner of a ladder that was set up in the corner of the ring, gouging a nasty gash over the back of his head, therefore causing blood flow. This was an all-out entertaining match, and it was rated by many critics as a 5-star match, which should be the first occasion for USW in history at that point in time. And overall, it would see the end of Morbid's 7-0 streak. It would see the beginning of Zach Hardy's streak. Morbid's career would be over until he would return at Key and Case later that year, beat Kyle Reese Jr. to earn a shot at the USW Championship, and would face Zach Hardy again later that month to try to redeem himself for retribution. But overall, this would be a fantastic match to look back on. 5 stars, in my opinion, because you can't really disagree with the majority, especially when the majority is right. So when it comes down to the show, eventually you would see Morbid kind of stagnate. He would be released from USW, after his own wishes, and then would re-sign. Zach Hardy eventually would go on to leave USW in 2016. Especially with the whole turmoil with his life, he would eventually go on to start a rock band. That would stop. He would then re-sign with USW in June of 2017. And actually cost Morbid his shot at the USW Championship in the process at Hellfire 2017, whilst also starting up a new rock band, which continues to this day. And he would go on to win a 10th World Championship in USW, the first performer to ever do so. And now both performers are riding high, with Morbid in the main event World Championship picture on Severity, and Zach Hardy feuding with Kyle Reese Jr. going into Call to Greatness 13 later this April. So with that being said, when you look at Call to Greatness 9, it was a pretty decent match, It was a pretty damn good show, especially looking back on nostalgia. You look back and you see where performers went afterwards, and what they accomplished and what they failed to accomplish, but at the same time put on a good show. And overall, the wrestling was fantastic. Even in my modern standards and modern tastes of professional wrestling, I enjoyed the show for what it was, and the action that it gave and prescribed heavily. It was a great show, and one that you can look back on extremely fondly, and I'm very happy to have been a part of it. And it was actually quick trivia, until Call to Greatness 13, this has still been my last Call to Greatness match I ever performed at, because for 10 I would be injured, and 10 I would have a torn tendon in my arm, and then Call to Greatness 11 and 12 I was not with the company, so I couldn't compete at. Now Call to Greatness 13, I'll fight my boss. So when it comes down to Call to Greatness 9, it's looked back on very well and very fondly as a great show and a defining show for USW. And it's understandable why. The card put together was with talent that was still improving, yet at the same time put forth a great show. And, the storylines were great, the booking was great, and aside from a couple blemishes, the show was fantastic and delivered heavily. Now, when it comes down to styles, you can't help but look at the show and go, this was very diverse, and much more diverse than you would see from USW in the current day. And I really liked the show, looking back on it, and I thought it was fantastic. I'm not going to give a rating, because I don't think I could do justice with the rating, but I would say, looking back at Call to Greatness, this would be the show that I would look back on and go, that's probably the greatest show I've seen in USW history to this date. So maybe that'll change with Call to Greatness 13 later this April. I don't know. But when it comes down to this, we're on Call to Greatness season. And I feel like I should go back and review every Call to Greatness show going forward, because it was honestly a really, really good show, and it's a great thing. I am tempted to just go back next week with 28 days left, and go and review Call of Greatness 10, and then 21 days and review Call of Greatness 11, and then review Call of Greatness 12 with 14 days left, and then this Call of Greatness with 7 days left. I don't know. Review Call of Greatness 8. I don't know. But this was a great show to review, and I'm glad I got to look back on. I have fond memories of it, and for good reason. And you know, looking at where the performers went from here on out really gives you a nice light on the whole show as it is, and especially more of an appreciation based off of their status at the time, and how they managed to put together such a great card with very little star power that they had on the roster. So it is incredibly looked back on, and for good reason. So that being said, that is going to do it for my review of Call of Greatness 9. What did you think about the show? Let me know in the comments below. Anything I missed, anything that I didn't, be sure to let me know. Until next time, thank you guys for watching. I sincerely hope you enjoyed. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. It is 8:18, and I gotta go watch USW's, what was it? Emergence pay-per-view? I guess so. Remember, like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'm Zach Hardy, and I am signing off.